For this.
Oh, hang on a minute.
All right. Hello. Welcome to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. Again, I am your host, Aaron Farmer. Today, we are here with Sally K. Norton. She blogs over at sallyknorton.com. You guys are going to want to listen to what she has to say. She is an expert in oxalates, oxalate poisoning, why oxalates are something that you probably want to avoid in your diet. So I can't wait to hear about this. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's fun.
Thank you so much. So let's get into your background. How did you figure out that you wanted to, start helping people with their health?
Oh, it was really early on in middle school when I decided I wanted a degree in nutrition so that I could, for myself, and help guide others who were interested in a life that was free of doctors and illness. I thought, if you knew how to avoid cancer and heart disease and whatever else, wouldn't you do that? So wouldn't knowing that be like the secret to a great life? And so thanks to this film strip that the science teacher showed in 7th grade, I decided right away, like maybe the next day, that a degree in nutrition made sense for a good life. It's been a long time. That was 1977 or something like that.
And what was your schooling like? Where did you get your degrees and whatnot?
Yeah, I went on and got my degree at Cornell University in nutrition, and then a master's degree in public health at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill.
Okay. So your story is interesting for a couple of reasons, but one one aspect of the story that I find fascinating to a lot of people that I talk to is you were, we'll say, a classically trained nutritionist. You went to school for nutrition. You didn't just watch a couple of YouTube videos to figure this out, but you came on the other side of this with the idea that maybe some vegetables aren't okay to eat, and that's. I'm pretty sure you didn't learn that in nutrition school. So let's get into what you were taught, and then what this transition looked like as you started to learn more about oxalates and how plants actually nourish our body or don't nourish our body.
Yeah. So classic nutrition education, is that our key question right now?
Sure.
Yeah. Cornell is considered one of the top schools for nutrition, up there with Harvard and a couple schools in California and one in Michigan. And that's like it. Those are the big ones in the country. And I thought I was going to a great school. And it was really surprising in retrospect how much unlearning I had to do. I had to become unafraid of supplements. I had to learn that sugar was not benign. I was told directly by a professor that sugar was benign except for dental caries. Now, you probably wouldn't agree with that.
No, I certainly wouldn't.
That's literally what one of the professors said. And we got a lot of pre-digested opinions like that. Instead of really learning how to learn and getting deeper into, how food is made and the effects on the body and how that gets studied and what we don't know, it was more like the professors would come up with these proclamations that we would believe because, hey, it was our professors. And it takes a while to undo that. And there's a lot of undoing and a lot of big gaps that you don't even know we're missing. Like, how does agriculture affect the quality of the food we eat? How does, in food prep classes, we did not learn about oxalates and whether cooking does or doesn't change things. We didn't learn about things like lectins, which are another chemical that are in, quote, natural foods that can be trouble for our health. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember learning much except tea could interfere with calcium and absorption. So you shouldn't have your tea with your meal, but space it like an hour after your meal. Like really simplistic things. Nothing really deep about these chemicals that plants make, of which oxalate is a major one that can get us into trouble with our health. So yeah, my education is a frustration. And it's unfortunately that a lot of people in the dietetics profession haven't really explored past some of these basic rules they were taught at the feet of their professors. And it's really holding us back.
Yeah, I bet. So what was your first kind of clue that what you were learning wasn't right?
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, I came up in an era before vegetarianism was accepted in nutrition. Okay. I was taught by a book called The Diet for a Small Planet.
Oh yeah. I'm
Remember
familiar.
that? That was like a big thing in the early 1980s, late
Mm-hmm.
70s, about we needed to spare the poor people of our meat eating, and that um, if we didn't eat meat, we could help the planet be a healthier place. And that was a whole premise of how to combine soy plus, other plants to try to get complete proteins, because plants don't have complete proteins, but you can get around that, and all this adding soy to everything. And at that time, that was a new idea. And it used to be that we always knew that a sugar-controlled, moderate carbohydrate diet that was built on animal foods was good nutrition for humans. But that shifted dramatically around that time at the end of the 1970s. And so people came up like T. Colin Campbell, who was one of my professors at Cornell, who were very pro-vegetarian, probably for ideological reasons because of concerns about animal rights, and were able to use their background in nutrition as a lever
Yep.
to make this other argument that there was some nutritional advantage to going in that direction of vegetarianism. So I was influenced heavily at the dawn of that whole explosion of acceptance now in the professions, and even took a course at Cornell called Diet for a Small Planet as a summer class. So where are we going with this?
Well, that's what you were taught. What was the first thing that kind of got in your head that thought that maybe this vegetarianism, the spinach wasn't the wonder food that you've been taught it was? Where I just want to know where that began.
Well, there's many scales on one's eyes that need to drop for you to finally see something. And it's been a long journey. I mean, during my vegetarian years, I turned vegan 8 years later for an additional 8 years. And during that time, I learned that I needed supplements. My health was falling apart at the dawn of my vegan years, and I'd never connected it with the diet until much later when I was in graduate school and really, really struggling. And it became clear to me at a very low point that I was not able to tolerate wheat and beans anymore. And I was pretty sure I wasn't tolerating dairy very well. Of course, I've been convinced out of that by John Robbins' Diet for a New America book. Right. So I during graduate school, I was forced out of the vegan thing from my health. And I didn't really connect that diet had malnourished me and depleted me and just destroyed my brain and my energy level at all. I was also, because I knew that sugar was benign, right? That I was allowed to have jelly on toast and eat like that all the time. Like jelly was free food. It didn't hurt you. And so I was pretty sugar addicted. And I learned at that point that I needed to get off the sugar. And it took me 3-year struggle just to get over my own carb addiction. And that was a long time ago. And got over that and added meat back and learned the Weston Price Foundation concepts of butter isn't bad for you. That was another one I learned at Cornell, that butter is the most saturated fat out there, and it's absolutely horrible for you because of that. And then there's one of my colleagues in school worked for an organization later at her whole career and got very down on coconut oil for the same reason. So, I was like, it took a while for me to get over the fear of fat. I was, during vegan years, low salt, low fat, sugar's fine. And I mean, it's the most ridiculous diet. And as for someone who's trained in nutrition, I mean, there are plenty of plump diabetic dietitians out there who don't know what they're doing, So, boy, having a mainstream education requires a lot of re-education. Unfortunately, I had to do it the hard way.
So how did you find your first Weston A. Price book? How did that come across your?
Well, I worked for the program on integrated medicine at the University of North Carolina Medical School. So we were putting together a grant when I started and we got funded with this grant, and I ran this grant for the full 5 years of the program. That was federal funding, so we could try to integrate concepts and information around holistic healing and the alternative medicine practices within the curriculum of conventional training in medicine, nursing, dentistry, pharmacy, public health. We were hoping to cover all the bases because we had a full suite of those health professions at UNC and serve the whole state for continuing ed programs across the state through the AHEC system. So my boss at the program of integrated medicine had a brochure on her door that was pro raw milk.
Okay.
And that caught my eye. I thought, Huh? Really? Raw milk? Wait a minute. That's not what I was taught in school at all, that raw milk was okay, not only okay, but preferable and good for you. And
Mm-hmm.
that introduced me to the Weston Price Foundation in 1999, when they were a fairly young organization back then. And so I was very blessed to have that leap from vegetarianism to Weston A. Price. So got comfortable with butter, and later on found raw milk for a patient and used raw cream to revive a patient who was essentially so brain damaged by the medical treatment he got in the hospital that my boss in the department we were housed in wanted to discharge him to a nursing home. And his mother begged that he didn't do that. And so she came to us at the program of integrative medicine to come up with a program to try to help him. And I used raw cream as part of his program. And by the time he left the hospital, he had recovered his ability to walk, talk, think, and be a human being. But the department had predicted that he would never do any of those things again. And I inherited the raw cream from the patient, who went back to slice and bake cookies. But I had arranged this delivery of raw cream for him, and that got me going on trying to make my own butter and my own sour cream. And at the beginning, I was so afraid of dairy, I made it into the most delicious sour cream, but didn't dare eat that. And then I'd make it into butter. Then I'd make it into ghee so that I'd be spared of all milk proteins. But eventually, I got sucked into tasting the sour cream, which was God's nectar, fabulous. And then the farmer was saying, come on, have some milk, try some milk. And I got pulled back into discovering that raw milk from A2 cows, and I'm not even sure if there's worry to, was perfectly fine for me, and so on. So through my trials and tribulations and just being connected to the world of healing and being in a role to try to think outside the box helped me eventually get to something that's finally working.
That's fantastic. So let's get into oxalates. What are they? Let's start there.
Okay, oxalate is a whole family. We say oxalates plural typically because it's a whole family of metal chelate salts that form from the base compound called oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is a naturally occurring chemical that forms easily in nature. It's very small. It's 2 carbons with 4 oxygens and 2 hydrogens on it. It's an uber tiny molecule. It's like barely twice the size of water. It's pretty small. And oxalate is made by plants, and we eat them when we eat plant foods. We also could be exposed to oxalate in air pollution and in cleaners. It's been used as a cleaner, oxalic acid, and it's soluble salt with potassium, which is a potassium oxalate. So the acid drops a proton and then picks up a cation like potassium, or tends to drop both of its protons and picks up divalent cations like calcium. That's when it'll bond almost permanently in the pH of body. But the soluble ones that are connected, the oxalic acids connected with potassium or sodium, that's still called oxalic acid, and it's used for its acidic properties to grab other metals. And it's been used in industry since the mid-1700s and was even used in households and purchased by households for cleaning at the home. They do things like clean rust off of engines and off of decks, and bleach fabrics, and even clean leathers, all kinds of stuff with oxalic acid. They put it in Barkeeper's Friend.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's the one cleaner we still use here in India. It's still in their laundry washing powders, and people use that laundry washing powder to commit suicide because oxalic acid is a lethal chemical when you get enough of it.
Okay. So what use does it serve in the plant? Like why do plants do it?
Yeah, the botanists are studying this and asking that question, and have come up with 7 or 8 different probable roles for oxalate in the plant. In the seed plants, oxalate is probably being used to pantry calcium so that the seed can hang on to calcium and then split off the oxalic acid part of it and use the calcium to run enzymes for germination and plant growth. So seeds are, as a group, they tend to be really full of oxalate, which include things like grains and beans and nuts and seeds and spices and so on. Is
it in all plants? So every plant has oxalate?
Well, a lot of plants have most plants have at least a trace of oxalate, but traces don't really matter that much. Things like cabbage and lettuce have very little oxalate. The plants that we still use as food, now there are plants that are so high in oxalate, we know they're poisonous. Your average house plant is poisonous because of the oxalate in it.
Okay.
That's why we don't eat house plants. Oxalate and other plant chemicals are a reason why you don't eat your bushes. You know, you tell your 3-year-old, don't eat the berries on those bushes. Those are not food.
Right.
So we have a line we draw. Some plants are totally not food and are quite toxic and could kill your toddler if they mess around with it. Okay. But the line where what we call food isn't been really studied well enough. And the foods that we eat a lot of that are really high in oxalate and on the verge of being super dangerous are foods that we now call really healthy foods, like spinach, Swiss chard, sweet potatoes, beets, beet greens, and then a bunch of nuts and seeds and things like that. Whole grains, the more whole the grain is, the more oxalate it has. Like if you call it healthy in the plant world, it's probably one of the high oxalate foods. Most of the low oxalate plants that we eat, like lettuce, are like, well, whatever, and radishes and stuff like that. They're like little decorations. They're not major foods that we eat a lot of.
So how did that happen? Like, how did we how did we decide what plants were food, even though, you know, that there was, why do we eat foods with oxalate? I guess
mostly because oxalate was hard to measure. And even though we've known about oxalate since the 1700s and started isolating it from sorrel, the original oxalic acid cleaner was called salts of sorrel. And that's because you could isolate it from sorrel. And they sometimes called it salts of lemon because it has that tart flavor that sorrel has. And people would even add a trace of it, a little pinch to their lemonade in order to make more lemonade out of the fewer lemons. So we've been messing around with oxalate for a long time. And then we realized how poisonous it was in the early 1800s when there was a whole series of accidental deaths from that household chemical, because it looked just like Epsom salts, and people would take a spoonful of the white Epsom salts and die 2 hours later because, oops, it wasn't Epsom salt after all. It was oxalic acid crystals or the salts of lemon. Because, you know, people weren't as literate back then. Things weren't carefully labeled and sealed, and you could go to the apothecary to pick up your Epsom salts, and maybe the guy who gave it to you doesn't read and gave you the wrong thing, or the young housemaid that you sent to go get it came home with it and mixed it up because she can't read, you know, who knows. But there was a lot of, that was the beginning of putting poison labels in the skull and crossbones on medicine and poisons, started during that period when people were accidentally consuming oxalic acid. So when it comes to the plants, I don't think it used to be that people ate plants the way we do now. I mean, we've accepted plants now as a central and necessary part of the diet. But that's actually a pretty contemporary idea. I mean, even when I was a kid in the 70s, even salad was really optional. It was a thing that California people did. It wasn't considered so critical to your health. Like if you didn't make your kids eat their salad, it wasn't bad parenting back then. Right. But I really think that the Weston A. Price research suggests that people who were living off the land and didn't have grocery stores and highways and refrigerated trucking lived on very few plant foods, and they were very seasonal. And that people who lived without many plants considered plants starvation foods. They were foods you would only eat if you were going to die from lack of calories. So as a desperation move, you can eat plants, but that's not really what is desired as a nutritious food for humans. That was the attitude, say, in Alaska with the natives there, that is well documented in these older papers. So what's happened in modern times is we invented war, we invented cities, we invented industrial jobs, and we displaced people from their normal ways of getting food, which would be to run around with small weapons. I mean, even 5-year-old boys probably 200 years ago knew how to take down a small animal for dinner. It was a basic skill I think that humans had, is how to hunt and gather food. And you could travel, say, from Connecticut to California, 300 years ago on a horse, or even walk there without a wagon of food behind you or a cooler, because you would just hunt on your way. You'd see an animal, you'd take it, and then when you camp, you'd cook it. Like, people didn't need to drag food around because they knew how to get by on animal foods. But the I think the love of plant foods comes from this industrialization and war and concentrating people in one place and a sedentary lifestyle. And of course, we got into farming. And then we got into a whole commodity-based economic system that in the US included California's great valley of producing produce. And my theory really is that things like the victory garden concept, which were put out by governments, especially the English and American government, especially in World War I, and then sort of repeated in World War II. This is the way we were going to get through this trauma, the stress of food shortages and perishable foods were harder to get during the war. People were really struggling to get by and under a tremendous amount of terror because of the war and just the fear of the death of the soldiers. That plants started to become a hero, because if you gardened, you could save us all and we'd win the war because you gardened, and you could get through these hard times because of growing garden produce. And so the produce suddenly becomes the hero of the war. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I mean, it's my own theory, but I really think that's part of how we got culturally wrapped our heads around vegetables being so important to us.
Okay. So let's talk about what oxalates do to us. What do oxalates do to us? Why should we avoid them?
Well, they grab minerals right away, and they, when they do that, they form crystals. So it takes 8 to 12 pairs of these ions of, say, calcium oxalate. So you're going to absorb maybe the salts of sorrel version, the potassium oxalate, into your body from your, we'll go back to the gut and health stuff, because there's a whole lot of gut damage that can happen. But if anywhere, either in your gut or in your bloodstream, if it moves into your bloodstream, it's going to eventually end up as calcium oxalate, but sometimes it's magnesium oxalate, iron oxalate. The oxalates are a whole family. So it starts off as a single molecule that forms these pairs that pair up into a nanocrystal. And that nanocrystal is very toxic. It's equated with asbestos crystals and silica crystals in the literature. Okay. So you basically have these little tiny invisible uber small nanocrystals that are equivalent to asbestos running around your body. Gets absorbed from your gut, goes straight to the liver, travels straight from the liver to the heart, then the lungs, then the heart, then to general circulation, and then most of it will get filtered out into the kidneys. But in the meantime, it's been traveling around being a toxic crystal that can get hooked up on cells and start accumulating in the body. It tends to get stuck on cells that are reproducing. Those cells are regenerating. Those cells have a lot more carbohydrate matrix on them, which is very sticky to the crystals, and then prevent that rejuvenating or repairing or growing tissue from properly repairing. And you end up with some fibrotic scarring or bad repair or old injuries that don't completely go away and things like that, because they get hung up on these tissues that are trying to heal and don't. They cause inflammation. As the crystals run around the cells, they're really perturbing the cells. The cells get leaky. They might leak potassium. It brings in the innate immune system. It inspires inflammatory responses around the body and can get you to the point where you feel like you've got 6 autoimmune conditions because your inflammation processes are flying perpetually, because you might be eating a high oxalate food like spinach or tahini or almond bread or cocoa-based fat bombs or whatever, peanuts and potatoes, potato chips. They're so easy to get into multiple foods that happen to be high in oxalate, and you're eating them continually. So you have this continual influx of something that forms a toxic crystal that can float around the body and the tissues and causes amazing amounts of potential mayhem depending on the dose and constancy of your exposure. And the really worst problem is that over time, you get more and more deficits in your metabolic health, changes in your metabolism, changes in how well your glands are working. It's probably affecting the development of diabetes because it's stressing out the pancreas and the adrenal glands, the testes, the ovaries, the thyroid gland. Research shows that by the time we're 50, 85% of us have oxalates stuck in our thyroid gland. 85%.
Well, I know thyroid issues are huge, epidemic right now. Everyone I know that's over a certain age is taking a thyroid pill or, has some kind of thyroid issue. And it's very, very widespread. It's interesting that you may have your finger on what's actually causing this. Are certain people more susceptible to oxalate poisoning?
Yeah, because first of all, the exposure through diet is your biggest risk factor. If you eat a lot of it routinely, eventually all the other risk factors will get worse. So the risk factors include your digestive surface. Is there inflammation there? If you've got leaky gut, inflammation, other aberrations in the gut integrity, then the amount that can get into your bloodstream goes way up. And
Okay.
the more you expose your kidneys to oxalate, the more they wear out. And then the amount your body can handle and get rid of through kidney excretion goes down. And so the longer you have this stuff, the more likely you're going to end up with gut damage, accumulation, and kidney problems. And so over time, your vulnerability to it gets worse. But if you've already started out with there are factors too that can affect your internal production of oxalate, because there is a baseline amount of oxalate that your metabolism generates as you create energy to run life,
Okay.
no matter what the fuel source is, sugar, fats, proteins, whatever. There is some byproducts there that produce oxalate, and a high sugar diet is going to produce even more internally. So there's that load as well. But if you're taking a lot of drugs, antibiotics are changing the microbiome. That's a huge risk factor for oxalate problems. Other drugs affect the gut lining, like NSAIDs are a big one that affects the gut lining and kidney health. So if you've been on a painkiller for a long time, and other drugs as well, allergy medications, over the counter, all these things ask the kidneys to do an extra work.
Okay.
And your liver too. So you're taxing your systems of detox and excretion with drug exposures, high sugar diet, and then of course other toxins as well that stress the liver and the kidneys. They just include environmental pollutions and consumer products, and Teflon and solvents and nail polish remover and cleaners, and you name it, pesticide. There's plenty of ways to overburden your kidneys and your liver and your gut. All those things are hard on the gut, including glyphosate, and we're eating that too. I mean, a lot of these pollutants come along with our diet. A lot of people aren't that particular about what they eat as long as it's cheap. And the cheaper the food, the more likely it is going to be poor quality, poor nutritional value, low nutrient density, and high contamination.
As we've changed our food supply, as we've genetically modified organisms, you mentioned glyphosate, as we've sprayed more and more glyphosate into our food supply. Have you? Is there evidence that oxalate poisoning has increased?
There are some connections with oxalate, and talked briefly with Stephanie Seneff last fall about this. And one thing that she pointed out to me is that in the later versions of Roundup, which is the major brand of glyphosate that's applied to food and lawns and gardens in your neighborhood, is one of the fixing compounds is an oxalate compound. So they actually put oxalate in Roundup to help it stick more to, I forget what its role is, to stick more to the plants and not wash away and be a more persistent chemical. So that's interesting that oxalate is sort of using its chelating power to help plants maintain the contamination from the glyphosate.
Right.
And just as an aside, because this is another huge topic that's very personally important to me, is that as we can casually go buy Roundup and spray it on whatever because we don't want a little weed by our fence post by the front door, we're breathing that daily for several days as we walk by our front door where we've just applied it. Our dogs are, our children are, and we are, because it re-evaporates every morning in the morning dew. As the dew burns off the next day, it's swirling around in the air unless the wind blows it away completely. So, I mean, that's another example of these sort of synergistic toxicities that just make it worse. But you don't need all these synergies for oxalate to mess you up, because oxalate was already known as a cause of disease in the 1850s before we had all these other ways to poison ourselves. Plants were doing a fine job of poisoning us without our help.
Okay, so you mentioned some of the things. You mentioned inflammation. You mentioned gut issues. What if you have too much oxalate in your system? What does that look like? Are there more things that we need to look at?
Yeah, right. Because fundamentally, oxalate's interfering with the basic metabolism that involves tissue repair and recovery and tissue maintenance. So if you feel like you're falling apart, that's one of the signs. It's very neurotoxic. So if you have funny neurological issues, like you don't sleep well, you're having memory issues, recall issues, you drop things a lot, you name it. There's a lot of things with neurofunction. It includes the control of sphincter muscles in the body. Like it's possible that a reflux condition is happening because the sphincter at the top of your stomach isn't working well because the nerves are essentially paralyzed and dysregulated, and oxalate can cause that. I've seen that on the other end of the digestive system where rectal function was gone, like the sensory neurons and the motor neurons in the rectum of this one person was causing fecal diarrhea for 13 years. She'd have 10 accidents a day, and it didn't take very long, 3 or 4 days off the almonds and spinach, where that finally stopped.
Okay.
Bone issues, joint and tendon issues, muscle knots, arthritis, inflammation, back pain, tooth sensitivity, tartar, eye issues. It's amazing. It just basically the trifecta is there's something going on with gut health, plus rheumatism or muscle, kind of musculoskeletal issues, and or neurological. So as long as you got gut issues plus either neurological or rheumatological muscle and joint pain, that's kind of what this looks like. But it can manifest as something as simple as a trigger finger or carpal tunnel syndrome or a backache, and then just gets worse where you start just not sleeping very well, and then you just feel more and more tired, or your brain isn't as sharp anymore. It can come on in subtle ways.
The number of, and again, I'm biased, because this is kind of the field that I live in, but the number of stories I have heard of vegans who have fallen apart, and the number of people who have had a host of, odd maladies that have cut plants out of their diet, totally, or, 90%, and have healed themselves are legion. I mean, there's so many. It's really amazing. So, everything that you're saying is really kind of ringing true to me, that it is these issues with the plants that are causing these things. But honestly, up until today, or up until I first heard about oxalates, I really thought the issue was insulin, that insulin was causing inflammation, and it was what was causing all of these diseases. And that as you eat a diet that is low in insulin and high in the fat that your body needs to kind of put itself back together, it can kind of heal itself. Do you think there's anything to that theory, or do you think it's all the oxalate? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think insulin is very toxic, and the two of them together are a nightmare. To be high insulin and high oxalate all the time is just a great way to have heart disease and fall apart and get arthritic and be miserable and lose your brain. The two of them together, they have similar effects of degenerating brain function and degenerating your general wellness. It's just oxalate can do more than insulin can in terms of make your bones useless and make you prone to injury, and your tendons not working so well, and make you need orthopedic surgeons. I think, honestly, if we had a zero oxalate life, the orthopedic surgery industry would go down to like 5% of what it is now. I think we could get rid of a huge amount of anything orthopedic in nature. Is
interesting.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned some foods that are actually big parts of my diet, but of kind of the keto, low carb field. Almonds, almond meal you've mentioned. That's everyone that makes a low carb dessert, it's pretty much made out of almond meal or coconut meal or coconut flour. You've mentioned a lot of these vegetables. What do you say to people who are on a low carb diet that it's not fixing all of their problems? How should they eat?
Well, it's pretty hard to do a low carb, low oxalate diet and stay vegetarian. That's for sure.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
You got to up the animal foods. And that's really difficult emotionally for some people. Some people get very attached to this wrong, misled idea that that's doing good for them and for the planet and for the animals.
Right.
Honestly, if you really understood a wheat combine and what it does to the topsoil and air quality and animal life, and how destructive that is to a natural diverse ecosystem, you would realize that a bagel is more destructive than a steak by a long shot.
Right.
So there's a lot of misconceptions, but people feel, I mean, I've had clients that I just adore and really admire because they were able to get through that identity crisis that occurred when they realized that their problem was from a high oxalate diet and they felt better on meat and animal products. It was emotionally really trying thing. Many people hang on to this idea for decades, and their specialness is their vegetarianism or their veganism, and it starts to become more of who they are than everything else about their lives as a mother or whatever. And so it's difficult for people to realize that you cannot stay where you are and still move forward. You do have to let go to move forward, and that includes bread. And, you know, if you can't do real milk, then almond milk is not the answer, and almond bread is not the answer. And if desserts are bad for you, pureeing up almonds and calling it dessert and throwing in cocoa butter and cocoa, which is another high oxalate food, might be entertaining, but it's not necessarily safe nutrition, especially if you do it on a weekly basis. I mean, if it's just once a year for one holiday, fine, but we're in no position to mess with our health at that degree. And unfortunately, nobody realizes that this is happening. Almonds are held up as right next to spinach as the savior of all of our problems. And it's quite the opposite. I think almond flour is a disaster. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that is really happening. I see the fallout from it. I see people really sick from trying to do these healthy things like almond bread and almond pudding.
Yep. So what do you advocate? Just a carnivore diet, just an all meat diet? How do you eat?
Well, I eat a carnivore diet, and I've been pure carnivore just for the month of April. But the last year and a half, I've been down to lemon juice, coconut products, and meat and milk, raw milk. But I don't advocate that.
Okay.
Not in the beginning anyway, because if you're eating almond flour and cashew cheese and spinach smoothies and whatever it is you're getting yourself in trouble with, you don't want to go straight to carnivore. That is a huge change, especially if you're also not fat adapted.
Right.
Your microbiome is used to all this other stuff, and you're going to completely change. That is too much metabolic trauma and change at one time. And any kind of thing that's disrupting your homeostasis can trigger more toxicity with oxalate, because what's been happening is our thyroids are full of oxalate, our bones, our tendons, our teeth, our sinuses, all kinds of tissues have traces of oxalate that's built up over the years, and the body doesn't want it there. And it's been waiting for this moment when you get out of the raspberry patch and get back to hunting, and it would clean it out. And, you know, historically, it wouldn't be long stretches of time where we'd eat so much high oxalate, but now you can do it all the time. So pretty much guaranteed, anyone who's eating any high oxalate food has some degree of deposits in their body, and they are going to want to come out, and you don't want to traumatize the body because too much could start moving at one time. So a big dietary shift changes your metabolism from one of the body's been hanging on to oxalate to one where it's trying to get it out, and it can just sort of start puking it out in a way that makes you more toxic than you were when you were eating your almond bread. And you can get into big trouble because you have big electrolyte loss when this is happening. And a lot of us have been restricting salt and are low in potassium anyway. And with a lot of oxalate in your system, you're going to be severely depleted in minerals and B vitamins and be sick.
That's so fascinating, because that's one of the things that I was warned about years ago was don't lose weight too fast, because you can actually make yourself sick. Your body's letting go of all these toxins. I've never heard the toxin named before. So I'm wondering if these oxalates live in, you mentioned all these different places, but can they be in fat cells as well? And as these fat cells shrink, you can shed oxalate, oxalic acid into the bloodstream?
Oxalate is known to be in the skin, and it's known to form these lipid complexes and live in fatty tissues, and these lipid complexes that are a slightly different style crystal than the one they're usually looking for. And I'm not sure that we there's definitely some oxalate in fat. I mean, according to rat studies and studies like that, there's definitely some there. The bulk of it is maybe elsewhere, but it's one of many toxins that fat cells hold. So I think when you lose fat, you're not only, it's just a metabolic change is enough to release toxins like oxalate, not just from the fat cells. It's going to start trying to repair in general. If you're lowering your sugar and lowering your inflammation and your body's cleaning up and getting better and stronger and you're building muscle, you're stressing other tissues. You now can walk further and do more and exercise more, and those other tissues as well are going to start dumping oxalate. So you may be losing the toluene and the solvents out of your fat cells and some oxalate, but also start dumping the oxalate that's in your hip joint and in your discs or in your teeth or face. And so it comes along with it. So you see things like hemorrhoids and other sort of symptoms on weight loss that show up that it's like, what is this? So new problems come up with weight loss, just like new problems come up when you go low oxalate, even if you don't have weight to lose. For me, I only had a weight problem when my feet were bad at Cornell. I had to leave Cornell for 4 years for foot surgery. And it turned out, I found out almost 30 years later that it was because of my oxalate problem, that my feet were bad. They weren't recovering well. They didn't recover from surgery. And I have had foot problems until I found the low oxalate diet at age 48, 5.5, 6 years ago. And so that inherent toxicity that we have, a big change in the diet, when your body starts healing and recovering from our weight problems, our sugar addiction, our toxic vegetables and toxic almond flour, is asking a lot of the body.
Right.
And it's like the body's ejecting a poison, and in the process, the surrounding cells get damaged, which incurs inflammation. And so it hurts when oxalates come out of the body. It can cause joint pain and inflammation and fatigue and backaches and malaise. And one way you can tell if you're switching to a low oxalate diet or a lower oxalate diet and your body's starting to, or maybe already is, if you're living on almond bread, it's simultaneously constantly getting rid of oxalate and collecting it. And when you stop eating the almond bread, it doesn't mean that you're low in oxalate because your body's so full of it. It's just now what's in your blood is more coming from your teeth and your bones and your fat than it is coming from your food. You're still high in it, and that can last a decade.
Oh, that was my next question. So if somebody's had an high oxalate diet for 40 years or so, just to pick a number, how long does it take to detox?
Yeah, well, there isn't medical studies that tell us this, because actually medicine is sort of in denial about how easy it is to accumulate oxalate, and assumes that it's only after the kidneys are in failure that you're collecting oxalate. But in fact, every time you eat a high oxalate meal, technically your kidneys are in kidney failure because it's always more than it can excrete. So temporarily for like 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours after a meal, you go through a 3-hour period where you're in basically renal failure and oxalate accumulation. But so this garden variety where 85% of us have oxalate in our thyroid gland hasn't been really studied population-wise. So therefore, this reversal of this accumulation toxicity hasn't been studied, even in people who have a genetic disorder where they're reversing it. But on the street, those of us who are sick with oxalate and getting rid of it, it's probably 7 to 12 year process is about the range.
So do you think oxalates are kind of the master key to health, that once you get rid of the oxalates from your diet, once you get rid of the oxalates from your body, that's like the biggest thing that you can do to improve your health?
It certainly was for me, because I had already done everything. I'd gotten off the sugar, I'd done the GAPS diet and done every single diet you can imagine, always eaten healthy. That was my problem. That's what made me sick. Like for me, the only thing that really made me sick and the only thing that really made me well or put me on a course to being well was discovering the oxalate thing. So it's pretty shocking that, since the sugar thing is such a big problem and the trans fats are such a big problem and so many things are contributing to poor health, like just the empty calories and synthetic vitamins and not getting the right form and vitamins and so on. The oxalate is really the kicker, because if you can fix all those other things, and if you haven't fixed the oxalate problem, you're still going to be deficient in nutrients, you're still going to be toxic, and you're still going to have degenerating health, and you'll be aging fast and furious.
Fast. That is totally fascinating. I so appreciate you coming on and telling us about this, Sally. I want to be respectful of your time. Can you tell my listeners like where they can find you, if you have any publications you'd like for them to check out, all that good stuff, your social media, all that?
Sure. Yeah, I have a website that is, its URL is sallyknorton.com. That's Sally with a Y, knorton.com. And in the support section of my website, you can find a couple of free articles there, a couple of very inexpensive resources. If you really go all out, you could spend $5.50 or something like that on my site.
Okay.
Or something like that. It might get up to $6 if you're lucky. And there's free videos on there and lots of free information there and background about me. I'm playing around with Instagram these days, and that's SK Norton on Instagram. I am on Twitter, but not a whole lot. You probably right now better off using Instagram. And Facebook, I'm kind of not spending a lot of time there, but I'm there as well. You can find me. I'm easy to find. You look up Sally and Oxalates and I will come up. There's been a lot of podcasts recently, so if you want to hear this over and over again, there's like 10 of them out there right now.
Well, fantastic. Guys, we're going to put links to all of that in the show notes, to all of Sally's stuff. And you guys please go follow her on Instagram and check out what she's all about. Sally, thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome. I'm so glad you're interested in sharing this message with people. It's really going to help a lot of people who want to pick it up and
I think so. All right, guys, those of you that are listening, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.